The auction of shadows. The air was thick with desperation. It clung to the damp stone walls, intertwined with the scent of sweat, and something darker, something that reeked of human suffering. Flickering bulbs barely held back the pressing shadows, casting eerie shapes against the cracked concrete. Hushed voices murmured, the rustling of expensive suits barely concealing the occasional whimper of those who understood their fate. Sage Hathaway stood in line with the others, wrists raw from the tight metal cuffs that had bound her for what felt like days. The once pristine clothes she had worn when she was taken were now tattered, stained with dirt and dried tears. But despite the exhaustion in her limbs and the cold pit in her stomach, she refused to break. Her chin remained lifted, eyes sharp as she scanned the room. She had learned long ago that weakness painted a target on your back. Fear only made it worse. Cry, and you were doomed. Beg, and you were lost. She had seen the end of that road before, watched others fall apart when they realized they weren't going home. A voice crackled over the hidden speakers, mechanical and cold. Item number 32. A hand gripped Sage's arm, fingers like iron as she was yanked forward. She stumbled, barely catching herself before she hit the ground. The world blurred for a second, but she forced herself to stand straight. She wouldn't let them see her fall. The auctioneer, a skeletal man with sunken eyes, raised his hand. "This one is a rarity," he announced, voice oily with persuasion. Untouched, strong-willed, he turned her roughly, forcing her to face the hungry gazes watching from the dimly lit seats. Challenge. A ripple of interest passed through the gathered men. Powerful, wealthy figures who had long since stopped seeing others as people. To them, she was an investment, a possession, not a life. Bidding began. Numbers were thrown into the air as the tension in the room grew. 500,000, 700,000, 1 million. Her stomach twisted, bile rising in her throat. Then, a voice cut through the madness. Low, calm, and utterly detached. 2 million. Silence fell. The room seemed to shrink, the weight of a presence she hadn't noticed pressing down on her like a storm. At the farthest end of the room, seated in the shadows, was a man. Unlike the others, he wasn't drinking. He wasn't leaning forward with greed in his eyes. He wasn't whispering to anyone at his table. He simply sat there, still, watching. Sage barely registered the gavel slamming down. Sold. Before she could process what had just happened, hands grabbed her again. A guard dragged her forward, pushing her toward an exit where a black-clad figure waited. A man who had just spent $2 million to own her. She was no longer just a number. She belonged to him now. The mansion of silence. The first thing Sage noticed when she woke up was warmth. Not the suffocating heat of the underground auction, but a gentle, regulated warmth that wrapped around her like a blanket. The second thing she noticed was the silence. Too quiet. Her eyes fluttered open. Dim light filtered through sheer curtains, painting golden streaks over the elegant walls. The bed beneath her was absurdly soft, the sheets smooth against her fingertips. She sat up too fast. The world tilted. A dull ache spread through her muscles, but there were no fresh bruises, no cuffs, no chains. This wasn't what she had expected. Swinging her legs over the bed, she tested her balance before standing. Every step she took was careful, measured. She didn't trust this place, didn't trust the luxury. She moved toward the door, fingers brushing the polished wood. It was unlocked. Confusion flickered through her mind, but she pushed forward, stepping into a grand hallway lined with paintings that seemed older than the house itself. The walls stretched high, the ceiling adorned with a chandelier that cast fractured light across the floor. It didn't feel like a home. It felt like a mausoleum. Then she saw him, the man from the auction. He stood near a window, his back turned to her. The dim light sharpened the edges of his suit, casting half his form into darkness. His presence was unnerving, still, unshaken, like a predator that didn't need to prove its strength. "You're awake," he said, not turning. His voice was the same as before, cold, detached. Sage clenched her fists. "What do you want from me?" Finally, he looked at her. His eyes were unreadable, but there was no malice in them. No amusement, no interest, nothing. The single word sent a chill down her spine. People didn't spend $2 million on nothing. Silence stretched between them. Then, without another word, he turned and walked away, disappearing into the shadows of his own home. Sage hesitated for only a second before spinning on her heel. She ran. She made it 3 steps before a figure blocked her path. Rowan Calloway. His expression didn't change. If anything, he looked bored. "You don't understand why you're here, do you?" She glared up at him. "I understand plenty. I was sold like an object. Now I'm your property." His gaze flickered. A brief pause. "You're not my property." Her breath caught. He had said her name. She took a step back. Uncertainty clawed at her ribs. "Then what am I?" Rowan's lips parted like he wanted to answer. Then something shifted in his eyes, a flicker of regret. It was gone as fast as it had appeared. "You're safe here," he murmured. "That's all you need to know." Sage's pulse pounded. She had spent her life learning that safety was a lie, and something about Rowan Calloway told her he was hiding something. She wasn't safe. She was trapped in a gilded cage, and she would find out why. The gilded cage. The walls whispered secrets. Sage could feel them in the way the air carried silence through the grand halls, in the heavy presence of things unspoken. The mansion was too quiet, too still, a prison without bars, a maze without doors. She had walked these halls for hours, trailing fingers over cold marble, stepping on floors that didn't creak. And yet, she found nothing. No security. No cameras. No locks. It made no sense. The man who had bought her for $2 million had left no chains, no guards, no orders. Just silence. It was the silence that unnerved her most. Sage stopped at a set of towering windows, pressing her fingers against the glass. Beyond the estate walls, the world stretched into an endless sea of trees, their dark silhouettes swaying against a gray sky. A road ran through the woods, but it was too far. She wouldn't make it before someone noticed. If someone was even watching. The thought tightened something in her chest. It had been 2 days since the auction. 2 days since Rowan Calloway had taken her from that pit and locked her in this mansion without so much as a demand. She hadn't seen him since, and that made it worse. Because men like him didn't make mistakes. Rowan Calloway had bought her for a reason, and she was going to find out what it was. The ghosts of the mansion. Sage's footsteps were soft against the dark wooden floors as she crept down the long corridor, her fingers grazing the cool walls. The mansion was too clean, too untouched, like no one truly lived here. There was a lifelessness to the place. She had expected staff, housekeepers, perhaps even other captives. Instead, she had only seen glimpses of people in the distance, figures moving like shadows, silent as ghosts. None of them acknowledged her, and when she tried to speak, they vanished. It was eerie. She reached the library doors. They were slightly ajar. Sage pushed them open slowly, stepping inside. The room smelled of old books and faint traces of smoke. A fireplace crackled in a corner, casting flickering golden light over towering bookshelves and deep leather chairs. It looked lived in. The first place in this house that felt real. And then she saw him. Rowan sat in one of the armchairs, one leg crossed over the other, fingers tapping against the armrest. He wasn't reading, wasn't working. He was simply watching the fire. Like he had been waiting. Her pulse quickened, but she kept her voice steady. "You've been avoiding me." Rowan didn't react. "Have I?" She stepped closer. "You bought me." Still, he didn't move. "I did." She clenched her fists. "Why?" This time, he turned his head. His gaze was sharp, cutting through the dim light. "Do you really want to know?" Sage hesitated. Because suddenly she wasn't sure. Rowan leaned forward, resting his forearms on his knees. What do you think happens to people who are bought at auctions like that? Her stomach twisted. She knew. She had seen it before. The ones who were obedient were sold into power. The ones who were broken disappeared into places no one ever spoke about. She swallowed hard. You didn't buy me to keep me safe. His expression didn't change. Didn't I? Her breath caught. Because for the first time, something flickered in his gaze, something close to regret. Then, just as quickly, it was gone. You can leave if you want, he said. Sage blinked. What? Rowan gestured toward the open library doors. The exit is down the hall. No one will stop you. She didn't move. Because it couldn't be that easy. Because she knew, deep down, that he wasn't lying. Which meant one thing. Whatever Rowan Calloway had done, whatever reason he had for buying her, it wasn't about keeping her here. It was about keeping her away from something else. And that scared her more than anything. The unanswered questions. She didn't run. Not that night. Not the next. Because the mansion might have been a prison, but something about Rowan Calloway told her that whatever was outside those gates was far worse. She started watching him. He was different from the other men she had known. The ones who took pleasure in their power, who wanted to be feared. Rowan didn't want anything. He barely spoke, didn't entertain guests, didn't even seem to acknowledge the world outside this house. At night, she heard him moving through the halls, pacing like a man haunted by something he refused to name. And then there was the room. The one door in the house that was locked. She had found it on her second night, tucked at the end of the east wing. Heavy, reinforced. Out of place in a house that held no other locks. She had tested it. It didn't budge, which meant whatever was inside mattered. And if it mattered, it was the only thing that could tell her why Rowan Calloway had brought her here. The escape that wasn't. Sage moved carefully. She had waited until deep into the night, until the mansion had settled into silence, before slipping out of her room. The hallway stretched endlessly before her, the shadows clinging to the edges of the dimly lit corridors. She had no plan, only the knowledge that no one had stopped her from leaving before. And that meant they were waiting for her to try. She reached the back entrance. The heavy doors loomed before her, unlocked. Too easy. Her fingers hesitated on the handle. She pushed it open, stepped outside. Cold air hit her skin. She made it 3 steps before a figure emerged from the darkness. Rowan. He was waiting. Like he had known exactly what she would do before she did it. Her breath hitched. Did you think it would be that easy? His voice was calm, almost amused. Sage's fists clenched. Why leave the door unlocked? Rowan exhaled. Because I needed to know. Her stomach twisted. Know what? He met her gaze. His voice dropped to something quieter, something dangerous. If you still had something to run to. Sage's chest tightened. Because the truth was, she didn't. She had no home, no family, no safety outside these walls. And Rowan Calloway had known that. He hadn't stopped her, because he had known she would stop herself. But instead of dragging her back inside, instead of telling her what to do, Rowan simply waited, giving her a choice. Stay or leave. For the first time in her life, no one was forcing her into anything. Her pulse hammered. She took a slow step back toward the house. Rowan didn't move, didn't smirk like he had won. He simply waited. And when she finally walked past him, back into the place she had once sworn to escape, he murmured something so soft she almost didn't hear it. You were never supposed to be here. Sage clenched her fists. Neither was he. And that terrified her more than anything else. Beneath the surface of silence, the night settled over the mansion like a velvet shroud, thick with unspoken truths. Sage sat in the dim glow of her bedroom, her mind racing, replaying the night's events. Rowan Calloway had let her leave. No guards, no locked doors, no threats. Just the cold truth wrapped in his quiet words. You were never supposed to be here. She hated how those words stuck to her ribs, how they filled her chest with something she couldn't name. Because for the first time in her life, someone wasn't forcing her to stay. And yet, she had come back. Her fingers curled into the soft fabric of the bedspread as she exhaled slowly. Rowan Calloway was a man made of contradictions. He had spent $2 million on her, yet he acted as if she was an inconvenience. He was rich, powerful, and dangerous, but he didn't demand obedience, didn't try to control her. And then there was the locked room, the only locked door in the house. She had learned how to survive by recognizing patterns, and if everything else in this mansion was open, but that door remained shut, then whatever was behind it mattered. She had to find out why. The man with no chains. The next morning, Sage left her room with a plan. She wasn't running anymore. She was hunting. Rowan had spent the past few nights in the library, sitting in front of the fire like a man waiting for something to burn. If she wanted answers, that was where she would start. She found him exactly where she expected, seated in the same leather armchair, a glass of whiskey untouched beside him. He wasn't reading. He wasn't working. He was just staring at the flames. Sage leaned against the doorway. You didn't sleep. Rowan didn't react. Neither did you. She stepped closer, arms crossed. I have a lot of questions. This time, his gaze flickered to hers. And I have very few answers. She narrowed her eyes. You bought me. I did. You let me leave. I did. Her jaw clenched. Why? Rowan studied her, his expression unreadable. Then, finally, he sighed, setting his glass down. Tell me, Sage, he murmured, if you had walked out of that door last night, where would you have gone? Her breath hitched. She had no answer. Because he was right. There was nowhere to go. Rowan tilted his head slightly, his eyes sharp. You're not here because of me. Sage swallowed. Then why am I here? Something flickered in his gaze. Regret. Amusement. She couldn't tell. And then Rowan Calloway did something unexpected. He stood, stepping toward her slowly, until he was close enough that she had to tilt her chin to meet his eyes. You think this is about you, he murmured. But I promise you, it's not. Sage stiffened. Then what is it about? Rowan didn't answer. Instead, he brushed past her, disappearing down the hall, leaving her standing there, frustration burning in her chest. Because she knew now. He wasn't keeping her here to control her. He was keeping her here to protect her. And that terrified her more than anything. The ghost in the hallway. That night, Sage followed him. She had spent years learning how to move unseen, how to slip through shadows without being noticed. If Rowan thought she was going to sit in her room like an obedient guest, he was wrong. He moved through the mansion like a phantom, his footsteps silent, his posture rigid. He wasn't going to the library this time. He was going to the locked door. Sage pressed herself against the wall as he pulled out a key and slid it into the lock. A soft click. The door opened, and Rowan disappeared inside. Sage counted to 10. Then she moved. She had picked locks before, old ones, rusty ones, even electronic ones. But the one on this door was different. It wasn't just meant to keep people out. It was meant to keep something in. She pressed her ear against the wood. Silence. And then, a sound. Faint. The sound of a music box. Sage's stomach twisted. She had to know. The room of ghosts. She waited until Rowan left before moving. The hallway was empty, silent as a graveyard. The lock was complicated, but not impossible. She worked quickly, keeping her breath steady. A soft click. The door creaked open. The room was small, forgotten, and filled with memories. The walls were lined with photographs, old, yellowed at the edges. Some were pinned to the walls. Others were tucked into glass frames. At the center of the room was a board covered in newspaper clippings. A fire. A tragedy. 2 dead, 1 survivor. Sage's breath caught as she scanned the articles. The Calloway fire. The billionaire's tragedy. Survivor of the Calloway family fire remained silent. Her fingers trembled as she traced the words. And then her eyes landed on a name. Gabriel Pierce. The words blurred as her mind tried to process it all. Rowan Calloway wasn't just rich. He was the last surviving member of a family that had been murdered in a fire that had been set intentionally. Her heart pounded as she scanned the photographs. In the center of them all was a man in a dark suit, a man who stood beside Rowan's parents, a man whose eyes held something cold. Gabriel Pierce. Sage exhaled shakily. Rowan hadn't saved her because he was kind. He had saved her because someone else wanted her gone. A creak sounded behind her. Sage froze. And then, a voice. Low, dangerous. You shouldn't be here. Her stomach dropped. She turned slowly. Rowan stood in the doorway, his expression carved from stone. But it was his eyes that made her breath catch. Because for the first time, he wasn't cold. He was furious. The truth that should have stayed buried. Rowan stepped inside, shutting the door behind him with a soft click. Sage's pulse hammered. She had seen the way he moved, the way he fought. If he wanted to keep her silent, he could. He could end this right now. But he didn't. Instead, he exhaled slowly, pressing his fingers against his temples. Tell me, he murmured, his voice dangerously soft. How much did you read? Sage swallowed. Enough. His eyes darkened. Then you know. She nodded. Gabriel Pierce killed your family. The word hung in the air. For a moment, Rowan said nothing. Then, finally, yes. Sage's breath caught. He had spent years hiding this, burying it. But now, it was out. Rowan's jaw tightened. And now, because you know, he's going to come for you too. Her stomach twisted. Because she knew one thing for certain. Gabriel Pierce wasn't just the man who had destroyed Rowan's life. He was the reason Rowan had bought her. And now, he knew she existed. Sage clenched her fists. This wasn't about escape anymore. This was a war. And whether she liked it or not, she was now a part of it. A war that was never meant to be hers. Sage had spent most of her life running. From danger. From men who saw her as nothing more than something to take. From a world that never gave her a choice. Now, for the first time, she wasn't running. She was trapped in someone else's war. And she had no idea how to survive it. The storm before the fire. Rowan Calloway hadn't spoken since she read the files. He hadn't yelled, hadn't threatened her, hadn't done any of the things she expected. Instead, he had just looked at her. Not with anger, not even with fear, with something worse. Resignation. Like he had always known this would happen. Like he had been waiting for the day someone pulled back the curtain and saw the truth he had spent years trying to bury. Sage's breath was uneven as she stood in front of him, her pulse thrumming in her ears. She should have been afraid. Instead, she felt something else. Something sharp. Something she didn't want to name. Because this wasn't about her. This was about a man who had been living with a ghost for far too long. Rowan turned away from her, his movements slow, careful. He dragged a hand down his face, exhaling sharply. Then, without looking at her, he said, "You don't understand what you've done." Sage's jaw tightened. "I understand that Gabriel Pierce killed your family." Rowan's fingers curled into fists. "And now he knows you exist." A chill ran through her veins. She had already suspected it, but hearing it out loud made it real. Sage swallowed hard. "How?" Rowan turned to face her fully, his expression carved from stone. "Because you were never meant to be here," he repeated, voice controlled but laced with something dark. "The moment I bought you, Gabriel took notice. And now you've given him exactly what he wanted." Her heart pounded. "And what's that?" Rowan's eyes locked onto hers, unblinking. "Leverage. The floor tilted beneath her, because suddenly she understood. Gabriel Pierce hadn't just been watching Rowan. He had been waiting for anything he could use to bring Rowan to him. And now he had her. The name that was a death sentence. Sage had spent most of her life avoiding the kind of men who controlled worlds. She knew what they looked like, how they moved, how they hunted. And yet Gabriel Pierce was different. He wasn't just another man with power. He was the man who had burned down Rowan's entire life and left him alive just to watch him suffer. And now he had his eyes on her. Rowan grabbed the files off the desk, flipping through the pages with sharp, precise movements. His expression was unreadable, but Sage could feel the storm beneath his skin. "Gabriel doesn't act unless he's already won," he muttered. Sage clenched her fists. "Then why hasn't he killed you yet?" Rowan's lips pressed into a thin line. "Because he doesn't want me dead." Sage felt her breath hitch. "What does he want, then?" Rowan finally looked up, his gaze dark and unreadable. "To break me." The words settled between them like a final warning. Sage took a slow, careful step forward. "And now he's going to use me to do it." Rowan didn't move, didn't blink. He didn't need to answer. She already knew. The man who had nothing left to lose. Sage had always known there were worse things than death. Being owned, being controlled, being used as a weapon against someone else. And now she had become Gabriel Pierce's favorite weapon. She exhaled, steadying herself. "So what do we do?" Rowan was silent for a moment. Then he moved. He tossed the files onto the desk, grabbed a gun from the drawer, and slid it into his holster. His every movement was cold, mechanical. Sage's pulse spiked. "Rowan." He met her gaze, his voice like steel. "We don't run." She swallowed hard. "Then what?" Rowan's fingers tightened around the gun. "We end this." The plan that wasn't a plan. Lucian arrived at the mansion an hour later. Sage had only seen him a handful of times, but she already knew one thing. He was the only person Rowan trusted, and that made him dangerous. Lucian stepped inside, his sharp blue eyes flicking between them. "So," he drawled, voice low and amused, "are we finally playing the game?" Rowan exhaled sharply. Gabriel made his move. Lucian's smirk faded instantly. "Shit," he muttered. "That means—" Rowan nodded once. "He knows about Sage." Lucian cursed under his breath. Sage crossed her arms. "So what's the plan?" Lucian blinked at her. Then he looked at Rowan. "Oh, I like her." Rowan sighed, rubbing his temples. "Lucian." "No, really," Lucian said, grinning. "Most people freak out when they hear that a world-class murderer has put them on his hit list, but not her. I respect it." Sage narrowed her eyes. "I'm still standing in the room." Lucian gave her a lazy salute. "Duly noted." Rowan pinched the bridge of his nose. "Lucian." Lucian raised his hands. "Fine, fine. So we're doing this now. No more hiding." Rowan's jaw clenched. "No more hiding." Lucian studied him for a long moment. Then he sighed. "Well, it's about damn time." The final move. Rowan had spent years avoiding this war. And now it had found him anyway. Sage sat in the corner of the room, watching as Rowan and Lucian went over locations, resources, weapons. She knew what they were doing. Planning for a fight. A war. Rowan hadn't said it out loud, but she knew. This wasn't just about survival anymore. This was about finishing what Gabriel started. Lucian exhaled sharply. "You know he's baiting you, right?" Rowan nodded once. "I know." Lucian rubbed his jaw. "Then why are we walking into his trap?" Rowan looked up, his expression cold. "Because I'm going to kill him first." The room went silent. Sage felt her pulse spike. Because this wasn't a plan. This was a death sentence. She pushed off the wall, stepping closer. "You're not walking into this alone." Rowan's gaze flicked to hers. Yes, I am. Sage clenched her fists. No, you're not. Rowan exhaled sharply, stepping toward her. Sage, I don't need you to protect me, she said, voice steady. I need you to let me fight. For the first time since she met him, Rowan hesitated. And then, slowly, dangerously, he nodded. The war that couldn't be stopped. The house was no longer quiet. It hummed with tension, with preparation. Rowan stood by the door, gun in hand, body tense as he checked his watch. Lucian was beside him, rolling his shoulders, muttering under his breath. And Sage was standing between them, fingers curling around the cold weight of the gun Rowan had handed her. Because this wasn't just his war anymore. It was hers too. Rowan exhaled. Let's end this. And then they stepped into the fire. A war that couldn't be stopped. The mansion had never felt so alive. It wasn't just a home anymore. It was a battlefield waiting for its first shot. Sage could feel it in the air, thick with something electric, something dangerous. The silence was no longer peaceful. It was the kind of silence that comes before a storm. She stood in the dimly lit corridor, watching Rowan and Lucian prepare. They moved like men who had done this before, who knew exactly what came next. Sage. She had no idea what she was doing. But she knew one thing for certain. She wasn't running. Not this time. The first move. Lucian leaned against the table, rolling his shoulders. We need to assume Gabriel already has men in place. Rowan nodded. He does. Lucian frowned. How do you know? Rowan exhaled. Because I would. Sage swallowed hard. Then why haven't they attacked yet? Lucian smirked. Because Gabriel's not the type to waste an opportunity. He glanced at Rowan. He wants you to come to him. Rowan's expression didn't change. Then we don't give him what he wants. Sage narrowed her eyes. You're still walking into his trap, though. Rowan's gaze flicked to hers, unreadable. No, he said quietly. I'm setting my own. The unspoken strategy. Sage watched as Rowan and Lucian laid out the plan. Lucian's fingers tapped against a map spread across the table. Gabriel's base is here. He pointed to an abandoned hotel on the outskirts of the city. 12 floors, multiple access points, but only 2 real ways in, front or back. He'll expect you to take the front. Rowan's voice was like steel. We won't. Lucian grinned. Thought so. Sage stepped closer. So what's the plan? Rowan glanced at her. You stay out of it. Sage stiffened. Excuse me. Rowan sighed. Gabriel wants you alive. If you're with us, he'll change the plan. Sage's jaw clenched. I don't care what he wants. Rowan's gaze darkened. I do. For a moment, neither of them moved. The air stretched thin between them, sharp with unspoken tension. And then Rowan did something unexpected. He reached for something under the table and placed it in front of her. A gun. Small, sleek, deadly. Sage swallowed. Her fingers curled around the cold metal, feeling its weight, its purpose. Rowan exhaled. If you're going to be in this, you need to be ready to kill. Sage met his gaze. I already am. The night before the war. Sage couldn't sleep. She lay in her bed, staring at the ceiling, listening to the distant sounds of movement from downstairs. Rowan and Lucian were still awake, preparing for whatever came next, and all she could think about was the man who had burned down Rowan's life. Gabriel Pierce, a name that tasted like ash and blood. She swung her legs over the edge of the bed and moved toward the door, her bare feet silent against the cold floors. The hallways were dim, shadows stretching long under the faint moonlight filtering through the windows. She wasn't sure where she was going, only that she needed to move. And then she saw him. Rowan, standing in the library, staring at the fire, the same way he had on the first night she had met him. She hesitated. Then, slowly, she stepped inside. Rowan didn't look at her, didn't speak. just stood there, his hands in his pockets, his expression unreadable. Sage exhaled. You don't sleep, do you? Rowan's jaw tightened. Never learned how. Sage moved closer, her arms crossed. Because of him. A long silence. Then Rowan finally said, because of me. Sage's breath caught. She had expected anger, bitterness, hatred, but not this. Not guilt. She stepped beside him, watching the flames dance. It wasn't your fault. Rowan exhaled sharply, shaking his head. You don't know that. Sage frowned. I know that Gabriel Pierce is the one who started that fire. I know that he's the one who wanted your family dead. And I know that he left you alive because he wanted to break you. Rowan's fingers twitched. Sage turned to face him fully. But you're not broken. Rowan let out a breathless laugh, one with no humor at all. Aren't I? Sage didn't look away. Didn't blink. No, she said firmly. You're not. Rowan met her gaze, and for the first time since she had met him, he believed her. The final morning. The sun barely rose that day. The sky was gray, the air heavy, thick with the kind of tension that only came before a storm. Lucian arrived at the front of the mansion in a black SUV, the engine humming low in the early morning silence. Sage stood by the doorway, gripping the gun in her hands, her heart steady. Rowan was beside her, dressed in dark clothes, his shoulders rigid. Lucian leaned against the car, smirking. Well, don't you two look like you're about to burn a city down? Rowan exhaled sharply. Let's go. Sage hesitated. Then she looked at Rowan. Promise me one thing. He turned to her, his gaze unreadable. Sage's voice was steady. Promise me you'll come back. Rowan's lips parted slightly. For a moment, just a moment, his mask cracked. And then, finally, he nodded. Sage exhaled, feeling something tighten in her chest. Because she knew. This wasn't just a fight. This was the end. And not all of them were coming back. The road to the fire. The car ride was silent. Lucian drove with one hand on the wheel, eyes locked on the road ahead. Sage sat in the back, her fingers curled into fists, her breath slow, steady. Rowan sat beside her. Not speaking. Not moving, just waiting. And then, Lucian's voice cut through the quiet. We're here. Sage looked up. And there it was, the abandoned hotel. Gabriel Pierce was inside, waiting. And so was the end of this war. Rowan exhaled slowly, gripping the handle of his gun. And then, without another word, they stepped into the fire that wouldn't die. The air around the abandoned hotel was thick with something unspoken, the kind of stillness that only existed in places where death had already been invited inside. Sage stood outside the entrance, gripping the gun Rowan had given her. Lucian had already gone ahead, slipping through the shadows like a ghost, clearing the path. But Sage barely noticed, because Rowan wasn't moving. He stood at the base of the stairs, staring up at the building like it was something alive. Something breathing, watching. And for the first time, Sage saw it. The hesitation. The weight of years pressing down on his shoulders. This wasn't just another fight. This was the moment Rowan Calloway had spent his entire life waiting for, and he wasn't sure if he was going to make it out alive. Sage's heart pounded. She took a slow step closer. Rowan. He blinked once. Then he exhaled sharply, shaking his head. Let's get this over with. Sage frowned. That's not. But before she could finish, Rowan started moving, walking straight into the building where Gabriel Pierce was waiting for him. And for the first time since she had met him, Rowan Calloway looked like a man who had already decided how this was going to end. Sage clenched her fists. Because she wasn't letting that happen. The ghosts in the dark. The first thing Sage noticed was the silence. The entire building felt wrong, too empty, too expectant, like it was holding its breath. Lucian had taken point, leading them through the side entrance, his gun drawn. They moved carefully, their footsteps echoing through the hollow corridors. Rowan barely spoke, but Sage saw it in his movements, the way his hands flexed at his sides, the way his gaze flicked to every dark corner. He knew something was wrong. Sage gripped her gun tighter. "How many men do you think he has in here?" she whispered. Lucian smirked. "Enough to be annoying." Rowan didn't answer, because he knew the truth. Gabriel Pierce wouldn't just send his men to kill them. He would send them to watch, to see Rowan break. Sage exhaled sharply. "I don't like this." Lucian chuckled under his breath. "That makes two of us." Then, without warning, a gunshot shattered the silence. Sage froze. Rowan moved. Before she could react, he grabbed her arm, yanking her behind cover as more bullets tore through the air. Lucian cursed, ducking behind a rusted filing cabinet. "Well, I guess that means they know we're here." Rowan didn't flinch. His eyes were locked ahead, scanning the darkness. They were waiting. Sage's pulse pounded. "So what do we do?" Rowan pulled out his gun, checking the clip. Then, with terrifying calm, he met her gaze. "We kill them first." The first kill. Sage had never been in a gunfight before. She had seen them, heard them, watched men fall in alleyways when the wrong deal went south. But she had never been part of one. Until now. The moment Rowan moved, the air exploded. Gunfire ripped through the walls, sending debris flying. The stench of smoke filled her lungs. Lucian was already shooting, moving fast, silent. Rowan was something else entirely. He didn't hesitate, didn't flinch. He stepped into the storm like he belonged to it. A man appeared from the shadows, gun raised. Rowan shot him first. Sage's chest tightened. This wasn't just another fight for Rowan. This was a war he had already been fighting for years, and he wasn't afraid of dying in it. Sage clenched her jaw, lifting the gun with steady hands. A second man appeared. She pulled the trigger. The bullet hit. The man staggered, then fell. The world blurred for a second. Her hands were shaking. Her breath was shallow. And then Rowan's voice cut through the chaos. "Good," he murmured. "Now do it again." Sage exhaled sharply. And just like that, she stopped being the girl who had been sold at an auction. She became the girl who would survive. The enemy that wouldn't die. The gunfire stopped. The hallway fell into an eerie, suffocating silence. Lucian nudged a body with his boot, raising an eyebrow. That was cute. Sage shot him a glare. "Shut up." Rowan ignored them both. His gaze was locked ahead, toward the dark corridor that led deeper into the hotel. Toward Gabriel. Sage swallowed hard. "You okay?" Rowan didn't answer right away. Then finally, "No." And then, without another word, he started walking. Sage exchanged a look with Lucian, her pulse hammering. Then they followed. The last enemy. The hallway stretched long and empty before them. Every door they passed was open. Every room cleared. Sage didn't need to be told what that meant. Gabriel hadn't sent his men to kill Rowan. He had sent them to delay him. Rowan knew it too. Because when they reached the final door, the only door that was still shut, he didn't hesitate. He lifted his gun, pushed it open, and there, standing near the window, was Gabriel Pierce, waiting. Lucian let out a low whistle. Well, well. Gabriel turned slowly, his expression one of pure amusement. "Rowan," he murmured. Finally. Sage swallowed hard, gripping her gun. Gabriel's gaze flicked to her, his lips curving into a smirk. "And you must be the girl." Her fingers twitched. Gabriel chuckled. "I can see why you'd want to keep her." Rowan's jaw clenched. "Put the gun down." Gabriel sighed. "Oh, come on. We both know that's not how this ends." Sage's pulse spiked, because she realized something. Gabriel wasn't afraid. He was enjoying this. Lucian muttered, "I really hate this guy." Gabriel smiled. Then he moved. Faster than Sage expected, his gun lifting. Rowan fired first. The shot ripped through the room. Gabriel staggered. Blood bloomed across his chest. His lips parted in shock. Sage didn't think, didn't hesitate. She stepped forward, lifted her gun, and fired the second shot. Gabriel's body hit the ground. For a moment, everything was still. Then Lucian exhaled sharply. Well, Dan. Rowan didn't move. His hands were still clenched. His breath was uneven. Because just like that, it was over. The war that had haunted him for years. The nightmare that refused to die. Gabriel Pierce was dead. Sage slowly lowered her gun, her chest heaving. And then Rowan turned to her. His expression unreadable. His voice barely a whisper. You didn't have to do that. Sage met his gaze, steady and unflinching. Yes, I did. Because this wasn't just Rowan's war anymore. It had been hers too. And now it was finally over. A future built from ashes. The war was over. But silence was the only thing left behind. Sage stood over Gabriel's lifeless body, her heart still hammering from the gunshots that had ended him. She expected relief. She expected victory. Instead, all she felt was weight, like something heavy had settled inside her ribs, pressing against her lungs, suffocating. Gabriel Pierce had haunted Rowan for years, had controlled his every move, had made him live in a prison without walls, always waiting for the day the past would come for him. And now he was dead, which meant Rowan was free. So why did he still look like a man carrying a ghost? Sage turned slowly, her hand still shaking around the gun. Rowan was staring at Gabriel's body, his expression unreadable, his breath slow and measured. Lucian nudged Gabriel's corpse with his boot. He muttered. I really thought he'd put up more of a fight. Rowan didn't react, didn't move, didn't blink, like he wasn't really there, like he was still waiting for something. Sage's stomach twisted, because Rowan Calloway had spent his entire life preparing to kill Gabriel Pierce, but he had never stopped to think about what came next. And now he had nothing left to fight. The weight of survival. Lucian let out a sharp breath. All right, he muttered. We should go before more of his guys show up. Sage barely heard him. Her gaze was still locked on Rowan. He hadn't moved since the second Gabriel hit the floor. Sage stepped closer. Rowan. Nothing. Lucian frowned, nudging Rowan's shoulder. Hey, man, it's over. Still nothing. Sage's breath caught. Rowan had been silent before. He had been distant, unreadable, cold. But this was different. This was a man lost, like he didn't know who he was anymore. Sage exhaled slowly, stepping in front of him. Rowan, she repeated, softer this time. Look at me. A pause, a flicker of something in his gaze. Then, finally, he blinked. And for the first time since she had met him, Rowan Calloway looked afraid. Not of Gabriel. Not of death. Of himself. Sage's chest tightened. Because Rowan hadn't expected to survive this, and now that he had, he didn't know how to live. The end of a war, the beginning of something else. They left the hotel without looking back. Lucian drove in silence, his usual smirk absent. The weight of what had just happened hung in the air between them, thick and suffocating. Sage sat beside Rowan in the back seat, watching him carefully. His hands were still, his breathing slow, like a man who wasn't sure if he was real anymore. Sage hesitated. Then, without thinking, she reached out. Her fingers brushed against his, light, hesitant. For a moment, he didn't react. Then, slowly, carefully, his fingers curled around hers. He didn't squeeze, didn't pull her closer, just held on, like she was the only thing anchoring him to the present. Sage swallowed hard, her heart pounding in her chest. Because Rowan Calloway wasn't just a man who had won a war. He was a man who didn't know how to live without one. And that terrified her more than anything. The mansion that was no longer a prison. When they finally reached the estate, the sun was beginning to rise. Rowan didn't speak as he stepped out of the car. Didn't acknowledge Lucian. Didn't even look at the house. He just walked inside. Sage hesitated. Lucian sighed, rubbing a hand down his face. "This is gonna be bad, isn't it?" Sage exhaled. "Yeah." Lucian muttered a curse. "Guess I should go get drunk, then." Sage didn't respond, because all she could think about was Rowan, and the way he had walked into the house like he was still trapped in it, like he still wasn't free. The man who didn't know how to stop fighting. Sage found him in the library, the same place she had always found him. He was sitting in the leather armchair, his elbows resting on his knees, his fingers curled together, staring at the fireplace. Silent, unmoving. Sage swallowed hard. "You okay?" Rowan let out a slow breath. "You know the answer to that." Sage bit her lip. "Then say it." He didn't. Didn't move. Didn't blink. Just stared at the fire, like it held all the answers he didn't know how to ask for. Sage stepped closer. "Rowan," she murmured. Still, nothing. She clenched her fists. "You won." Finally, he looked up, and what she saw in his eyes made her breath catch. Hollow. That's what he looked like something inside him had finally broken. And she realized something. Rowan Calloway didn't know how to exist without a war. Sage's chest ached. So, she did the only thing she could. She sat down across from him. She didn't speak, didn't push, just stayed. Because maybe that was enough. The beginning of something else. Time passed in silence. Minutes, maybe hours. Neither of them moved. And then, finally, Rowan exhaled. Slowly, carefully. He ran a hand down his face, shaking his head. "I don't know how to do this." Sage's throat tightened. "What?" she whispered. Rowan exhaled again, quieter this time. "Live." The word hit her harder than she expected. Sage swallowed. "Then don't do it alone." Rowan's gaze flickered. Something shifted between them. Something quiet. Something real. His fingers twitched, like he wanted to reach for her, but he didn't. Because Rowan Calloway didn't know how to ask for something he had never been given. So Sage made the choice for him. She reached forward, her fingers curling around his wrist. A small, simple touch. But Rowan didn't pull away. And that was enough. For now. Because this wasn't the end. It was the beginning. And for the first time in his life, Rowan Calloway had something to come back to. Someone to stay for. And maybe, just maybe, that was all he needed. For now.